Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth.
And hello, everybody, and welcome. I am Doug King. Glad to have you with us here as we're continuing our discussion in this episode 2 of a series I'm doing on the biblical narrative, integral consciousness, and regeneration. There'll be many more conversations we have that relate to a new field called convergence. This is a term you are going to hear more and more about, convergence. What does it mean? It means that across this planet right now, there are groups of people. In one case, I'm participating in something called synergy circles. And synergy circles are groups of people that come from specific areas and backgrounds of expertise, in order to show how all of the different fields of study are converging and showing that they are interconnected. And furthermore, you're going to hear a term, the new unitive narrative, because all of these groups, and it doesn't matter whether they're from physics, mathematics, art, music, biology, technology, economics. It doesn't matter what field you hear from as we talk. You're going to see that all of them are realizing that there's been an evolutionary process that has been bringing the realization that all things and all people are interconnected, that all things are one. And that this oneness, which is very clear in the biblical narrative that we come from, has a nature. And that nature has a number of different elements, all of which we've talked about and will continue to talk about here on these podcasts. So these are terms you're going to be hearing about, and this idea of the biblical narrative and integral consciousness is just another aspect of convergence, because integral consciousness belongs to a field of philosophy that has been in existence for some time now, has its own authors, writers, podcasters, and has a lot to say about the nature of our source, just as the biblical narrative has a lot to say about our source and calls that source God. So, first of all, look, this is not a watering down of the biblical narrative. It's the opposite. This shows how strongly we're attached to the Bible itself, as if God is that limited. No. The biblical narrative converges beautifully with all other narratives because God's in physics and He's in mathematics and He's in biology, technology, art, music, science, all of it. That's why the narrative, when it's approached from an integral standpoint, converges. But we're going to look at today why the message of holding on to an identity called Christian will not converge and cannot be used in an integral approach to the narrative. That's going to get some resistance. I know you're shocked. Anyway, what is this regeneration? Just quickly, last time we talked, it is a term that applies to genealogy. It has a root that can mean birth, birthing. If I'm a good King James person, I know that Matthew and Luke spend a lot of time about begat. So-and-so begat, so-and-so begat. That's the same root of genealogy, because genealogy is a record of all who were begat from a certain line, which becomes a lineage. And then also the word means generation, as in this generation will not pass until everything's fulfilled. Everything the story's been leading up to, that generation, and not beyond it, that generation only. So you got genealogy, you got generation, you got birthing. All of these words belong to the transformation period in the first century. In the middle of that Venn diagram that you will see plastered all over my work. Birthing is a transformative experience. So, genealogy becomes in the biblical narrative one of the strongest indicators of how to understand human interconnectivity and how not to. So remember that the models of spiral dynamics and other integral models trace history, and they show that that history has moved from an archaic mindset that is egocentric to a tribal mindset that's ethnocentric, and now appearing on the planet is a new way of thinking called world-centric. Now, that's a pretty simple trajectory, egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric. That's pretty simple to say, but it's got very, very dramatic consequences. When you look at genealogy as in who begat whom, or what tribe you belong to, the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Levi, the tribe of Benjamin, you're talking about a tribe as a form. It is defined biologically. And when you look at the biblical narrative, you see the 12 tribes and so forth and what's going on there, they are also defined geographically. They get their own portion of land, so they're also defined geographically. But you can see how genealogy and the begatting was tied very much to identity. Well, when you get to the coming of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, the begatting of Jesus, the genealogy of Jesus, Jesus is identified just like every other character in the story. He is identified via his genealogy. That's why Matthew and Luke go into his genealogy, and why it was important to understand that he was a direct descendant of King David, because metaphorically, Jesus was going to come to fulfill once in that generation only, everything that God was revealing in terms of what the enemy was for humanity and how that enemy was defeated by the king who sat upon the throne on behalf of the people. We'll talk more about that later. But just trying to draw attention to the fact that Jesus was part of the begatting process. So Paul, when you read the book of Galatians, Paul makes the statement that Jesus was born of a woman, born under the law. Now, notice those two aspects are different ways of referring to an identity attached to form. Born of a woman, that's a biological form. Born in that tribe of Judah, the biological form itself. But then Paul says, born under the law. What does it mean to be born under the law? Jesus came into this world being born into a form known as the law that was and had been for centuries the identity of God as Israel understood it. But while that identity was a childhood understanding, while that identity began the children of God on milk, There was something that was more glorious that was going to help them transcend their understanding of that type of form attachment. Law is related to internal form because it is under law that one defines the boundaries or the box that you must be in order to be acceptable versus unacceptable. Jesus was born after the flesh, meaning, yes, he had biological form, he was part of the begatting, he was part of genealogy, yes, he was biological, but after the flesh for Paul means ultimately the human as source, meaning born by the human, birthed by the human. And so the law was used to adjudicate. Now we get into judgment. And remember, this regeneration was a time when the 12 apostles would sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes. I'm going to get into that and get into judgment, and I am. So I haven't forgotten, and we are going to talk about that. I've had some emails. Great input. And we need clarification on this because the old story that's been handed down since the Holy Roman Empire that everybody's holding on to, called Christian, it's a 2,000-year-old way of thinking. And that thinking got concretized. One of the examples of that, as I think about it, is the Amish. You know, we talk about the Amish, oh my, they just froze. They just stopped history. They haven't done anything differently. Well, that's really what Christianity has done since Constantine decided what Christology would be. So anyway, we'll get to that. But Jesus wasn't limited to that genealogy, born of a woman, born under the law. He became known as the firstborn from the dead. From the dead indicates that true identity, God identity, which is the only identity sourcing life itself, was not to be found by human doing and human attachment to any type of form, be it genealogy, the law, works, etc., etc. So Jesus died to genealogy. He died to it. Jesus was the last one, the last descendant of the Davidic kings. That was it. And Jesus had no descendants. He put an end to and died to genealogy. Now remember, Christology is not only individual, Jesus the individual, but it also applies to the collective known as the body. Well, that body, the collective followers of Jesus, were also putting to death identity via that realm. In fact, after the first century and the Roman invasion of Jerusalem, the fall of that temple and so forth, all genealogy was lost regarding the 12 tribes. From that time forward into this very day, there has been no tracking of lineage regarding tribe. The genealogy was being dealt with in that first century generation and not beyond. So Jesus did not come to destroy the law, but he came to fulfill it, meaning he came to show what its role and function was. And it was not to provide identity. It was not so that people would behave properly, believe properly, have the right morals, have the right ethics? Paul said, nope. You go down that path and you want to set yourself up and say you've done something, believe something, and you're okay, and other people have got to be converted and get to where you are to be okay, you're doing what I did. You are trying to establish a righteousness of your own. That is an old model that has served its time. The new discussion that's being seen in all fields of study is that we cannot attach to and hold on to these old narratives of doing. So death and resurrection, you think about that, that's transformation of the individual. Paul again goes through Galatians 4. We've talked about that. That's the study of identity. What do you got in Galatians 4? 2 women that are bearing sons. Here's your begetting. Here's your genealogy. And so it's a story of identity. Now, the one identity was dependent upon human doing. Abraham took a handmaiden, Hagar, and had a child. That's human doing. I'm proposing that an integral approach to theology is transcendent of the story being told by Christianity, and that is you have to do something. Now, there's going to be thousands of different interpretations of what you have to do and what you have to continue to do. But at the end of the day, it'll come down to something you need to do in order to become like the people that have it all right by their doing. And notice also in the story of Galatians 4, Paul makes the statement that the 2 dwelt together for a while, and one persecuted the other. Well, it was Ishmael who persecuted Isaac because Ishmael was the oldest. Christianity is the oldest. I can assure you that the persecution is going to come from Christianity toward what we're saying about integral theology because they're resisting anything that transcends their thinking, a thinking that they're holding on to that has been given to them by the Holy Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. So that's the way persecution happens, and we can expect that. Okay. We can also deal with that. It doesn't happen in a lot of the more progressive churches because they try not to get into any of these issues. They just want to, by any means, hold on to the identity Christian. But that's a problem. We're going to talk about it. Christianity is a tribe that differentiates itself from all the other tribes, all the other religions. And furthermore, you have a plethora of tribes, Baptist tribes and Pentecostalist tribes, Methodist tribes, Amish tribes, Mormon tribes. Are they really a tribe? And look at the Catholics. Whew. Boy, that's a problem. Unless, of course, you're a Catholic. So Christianity is based on tribalism, just as genealogy was, and this is the point. Jesus came to bring a new paradigm of thinking. He didn't come to freeze things in time as they always had been. It feels good to the ego to say, I've done this and I've done that and I'm in the right place and I get it and blah, blah, blah. And therefore, upon my self, my thinking, my converting, I've got the proper identity. And of course, it will relate to my denomination. And the reason I'm not Amish or Catholic or Protestant or, again, name one of the other thousands, the reason I'm not one of them is because, well, they haven't got the Christian thing just right. So instead of ethnocentric, we might say that the challenge before the biblical narrative people is Christocentric. It's all tribal. One other thing, I was looking at my notes and just looking at the word generation and where generation appears. We're very familiar with generation in the apocalyptic sayings of Jesus because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those Gospels make a centerpiece of Jesus' eschatology, and that Jesus clearly states it's all going down in that generation. All things will be fulfilled in that generation. So we're real familiar with it. But I remembered that Peter also had written an interesting phrase, and I took a look at it. It's in 1 Peter 2, if you want to read 1 Peter 2. And Peter starts off by saying, first of all, he says Jesus was chosen. I want to talk about that word in a minute. As the individual, remember there's individual and collective. Jesus is chosen as the individual, the firstborn one. But remember, after the firstborn one comes the firstborn ones. And not only was Jesus chosen, Peter said to the followers, to the collective, you are a chosen generation. A chosen generation. Not just a chosen people, but a chosen generation. If I read Hebrews, the book of Hebrews carefully, I will see that it emphasizes over and over again that the work of Jesus, the transformative work of Jesus, was a one time, that generation, and for all, for everybody, universal. His work was universal. Jesus was a universalist. He believed in a universal God, not a limited one. So Jesus' work was once and for all. We get that. We don't have a problem with that. If somebody claims to be Jesus today, walking around on the planet today, well, we probably going to recommend they get some therapy. However, when it comes to the collective, they were a chosen generation. And yet, here we are for 2,000 years, saying that they do still exist. That word chosen is the word electone. Well, you know what that means, elect. That's another Christian creed, dogma, doctrine that is handled differently depending on what denomination you go to, but if you are a Christian, you are part of the elect. That's what the narrative says, and I believe that. They were chosen and they were elected. But what were they elected for? They were elected to show that God identity does not come through human doing, and their death was a death to doing. It was a death to the world of flesh, which is the world of doing, which is the way Ishmael was born. It is human self as source. That self is what Jesus put to death, the self. And so the chosen generation for the collective was a once, that generation, and for all. One of the things that you hear in the Mormon church that may be confusing is when Paul is talking about resurrection to the Corinthians, he talks about the followers of that chosen generation, that transformed group, being baptized on behalf of the dead, being baptized for the dead. And you go, what in the world is that? Baptized for the dead? Well, let's remember that they're mirroring the work of the individual Jesus Christ. And what did Jesus Christ do? He died on behalf of the world. What was the chosen elect body doing? They were dying with Christ. Well, what was the meaning of Christ's death? He died on behalf of the world. When they were being baptized, they were dying on behalf of the world. They were modeling death to doing for the entire world to see. It was on the world's behalf that they lived and that Jesus lived. But they were chosen to be firstborn ones. Okay, so you got Jesus, firstborn one. Then you got the body, they're firstborn ones, plural. Well, what comes next? What comes next is an entire new creation, being reborn, a complete new heaven and earth was being birthed, begatted. This is the regeneration, the regenealogizing process, where we move from biological form into this new heaven and earth, which is formless, which is of the nature of God and Spirit as source, without boundary. You're not kind of in a new creation, you're in the new creation. There were in the story two sons and all that we've talked about, and there are two creations, the old creation and the new creation. The old creation is past. It came to an end. That's eschatology. It's over. You can't be in it. There's only the new heaven and earth now. That's it. And everyone's in it. And that was a birthing process that was happening on a collective level. An entire creation was being birthed. And what's interesting about that is when Paul wrote to the Romans, and specifically in chapter 8, if you want to study that, he says that creation that was passing, that they were sitting there in, but they were seeing it pass and it was going to soon vanish away, he said that creation was groaning as in childbirth pain. And immediately I'm thinking, Paul grabbed that off of Jesus, because when Jesus was talking in Matthew chapter 24, and he was talking about everything, the wars and the rumors of wars and mothers and daughters and fathers and sons and all of the upheaval of that particular generation, he said all these things are indicative of birth pains. And here's Paul saying, yeah, the whole creation right now, the existing creation, there's birth pains associated. Why? Because a brand new creation is being birthed. There's a new begatting. There's a new genealogy. And guess what? That genealogy is once and for all, for everybody. That's its nature. It's all through the literature of the writings of the apostles, if we take a good look at it, if we really take a look at birthing and begatting and identity. Those were the birth pains of generation and regeneration. So Israel herself was at the root of this. The reason Paul used this language where he said, you don't bear the root bears you, is because Israel herself was being transformed. So when we talk about judgment, when we get to it, and we will, I've probably got, looking at my notes, probably got another podcast before I finally get to judgment. But when we look at Jesus' words about regeneration and sitting on 12 thrones and judging the 12 tribes, that sounds pretty negative for Israel. But in fact, that was part of a process by which Israel's true identity was being revealed. It was part of a process by which God was revealing the basis upon which he would accept her. And it wouldn't be on the basis of her doing. It would be on the basis of his deliverance, his resurrection power, his spirit, and God as source alone. Period. So we'll talk about that more when we get into the next podcast or two. We'll talk about this model of new universal identity, what this is meaning. I'm going to continue to update you too as I talk to people who are in some of these other fields. So you can see that the biblical narrative right now is a real problem to people in many of these other fields because it doesn't look like a convergent narrative at all. It doesn't look like a unitive narrative. It looks pretty divisive. So I'll try to keep you posted on those conversations and any podcasts and things that are coming out as they do. Let me say one final word before I sign off here, and that is this. I grew up a Christian. Christian people are just like me in that they're trying the very best they can to figure out God identity. Just like Israel, Christians are people that God loves just as much as God loves me or anyone else on this planet. This whole thing that we're talking about is having a better understanding of the interconnectivity of all things so we can take down the walls of hostility, which was the role and function of Jesus, so that we can get rid of division and so that we can finally have peace with each other and all others on this planet. This is not a denigration of anyone. This is an urging to look at a message, a narrative, whose time has come with regard to regenerating, reinterpreting, and renewing our understanding and our views. So, I don't end this on a negative note, I end it on a positive note. Not because of anything I've done, but I end it on a positive note because all things are in the hands of that which is source. So everything's good, as we like to say. So anyway, have a great week out there. I'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.